Malign portents, the joy of battle. Madzek's axe struck home, cleaving through bone and smashing aged leather into clouds of choking dust. The fell magic that knitted his foe together evaporated, and loose bones tumbled to the ground. The Deathbringer felt something clawing at his leg and stomped his iron-shod boot through the ribcage of the crawling figure. In his crimson fury, he barely registered that the squirming form was one of his fellow reavers. "He sees me!" the broken warrior choked, his bloodshot eyes rolling back as his mouth frothed with blood. "He sees me!" Madzek kicked and stamped again and again until all motion ceased. Through the blood thundering in his veins and the fingers of red mist crawling across his vision, he took in the battlefield. Ahead, 10 scalp-takers held the bridge of sinew that stretched from the fortress gatehouse, holding at bay a host of rotting, grasping cadavers with axe and flail. No more than chattel. He turned, seeking worthier prey. Around him, more blood warriors held the central chamber. Above, silver moonlight bled into the pillared vestibule from great breaches in the roof. A steady stream of animated corpses hurled themselves through these holes, uncaring of the bone-shattering drop to the fortress floor. The risen dead had enveloped Cold Spite Cairn like a flood. The barrow tombs of the harrowed Spine Mountains had been emptied. There were no end to the enemy's numbers, and no sign of Marika Bloodsky or her war host. How long had they held this fortress? Days beyond end. Time had lost much of its meaning in this place. Madzek of the Flayed Legion understood well enough that the War Queen had sent him here to die, to hold back the enemy as long as he might, while her armies pressed onwards into the grave god's domain. The thought tore an ecstatic bark of laughter from his throat. It would be an end worthy of a champion such as he. "The eye of the blood god is upon us!" he screamed. "Skulls for the skull throne!" Another boulder of fused bone from one of the enemy's artillery pieces slammed home, tearing free a shower of masonry and tumbling down into the hall to crush a half-dozen of the warriors to gory paste. Scores of skeletal warriors swarmed through the fresh breach. Many tumbled the 300 or so feet to the blackstone tiles below, shattering into pieces. Others landed heavily upon the piles of bones and dead bloodbound that littered the chamber, before rising to their feet and launching themselves into the fray. Even as more blood warriors were dragged to the floor, slashed and torn apart by rusted blades, the rear doors of the hall burst open. In marched ranks of silver-armored skeletons in tight formation, their motion so unnaturally synchronized they seemed as reflections in a mirror. The gleaming tips of the halberds flashed in the moonlight, and a standard, depicting a dragon pierced through the heart by a barbed arrow, fluttered above their number. Blood reavers charged, howling at this new foe, and were cut down by measured sweeps of those wicked halberds, spitted upon the weapon's cruel spiked tips, hacked apart by their axe-like blades. At the heart of the skeletal advance were 3 regal forms, clad in splendid gold chain. They wore crowns bedecked with jewels, and their eyes burned with green fire. Even in death, they radiated power and authority, directing their minions into the battle with sweeping gestures of their blades. Madzek roared in delight and charged right at the heart of the gleaming host. His ravening blood warriors raced alongside him, their own demented howls echoing across the soaring chamber. The Deathbringer saw the halberd sweep across to meet this new threat, but the blood rage was upon him, and no mere weapon could stay his charge. He felt his skin tear open, and delighted in the pain, using it as fuel for the raging fire within him. One skeletal face burst apart under the descent of his axe. Another swing smashed aside a shield and broke the arm that held it into pieces. So tight was the press that he found himself staring into the empty sockets of an armoured warrior. He headbutted it, and the demon maw of his helm bit deep into the wretch's skull. Still, it clung to him, trying vainly to bring its weapons to bear in the close quarters. Again and again he smashed his face into it, until his vision blurred, and blood filled his eyes. The skeleton skull was spiderwebbed with cracks, but still it fought on doggedly. Abandoning its halberd, it drew a short dirk and stabbed it into Mazdek's side, lighting a painful fire in his belly. Mazdek leaned back as far as he could and drove his head forward one final time, and the skeleton skull collapsed entirely, exploding into powdered bone. The thing collapsed limply to the ground as Mazdek fell to his knees, racked with choking gasps of laughter. Ahead, the trio of deathless knights were carving apart his blood warriors. One carried a colossal two-bladed axe, the others hacked down foe after foe with contemptuous slashes from their heavy broadswords. A mountain of torn and hacked corpses lay at their feet, blood seeping in great rivers. "Khorne claims this place!" screamed Mazdek, raising his weapon and aiming it at the white tyrants. "As I claim your skulls for his throne!" And with that he charged, barreling past a row of slashing weapons and leaping upon the closest of the whites. He bore the undead lord to the ground. His axe fell once, twice, 3 times, and the dead king's armour was rent asunder. Still his adversary reached out a bony hand to close around his throat, its hateful eyes staring into his own. He raised his axe again and hacked off the white's gorget, snarling in triumph as his weapon cleared through the metal and bone and took off the thing's head. The Deathbringer felt a sword slide through the metal plate at his back and howled as a rush of grave cold agony speared through him. He felt true pain for the first time in years, draining his strength and numbing his limbs. Staggering to his feet, he found himself faced by the 2 remaining lords. The sword of the nearest was slathered with gore, and the fell weapon pulsed with tides of amethyst magic. Mazdek swayed, vision blurring yet further. Ahead, he could see that the entirety of the grand chamber was a churning mass of bone, a swarming tide of undead creatures swallowing everything in its path. More skeletons were pouring from above, and yet more were being reconstituted from the piles of bones that littered the cairn. Less than a dozen of his warriors remained, islands of blood-red armour amidst the relentless surge. They were drowning, pulled down by scores of grasping hands to be torn limb from limb. It was the most glorious sight that the Deathbringer had ever seen. Surely with this final offering, the blood god's gaze would be upon him. Surely such a bounty of blood and skulls would earn him a place in Khorne's eternal legions to fight and slay forevermore. "This is not my end, kings of nothing," he said, and laughed through strings of bloody drool. The white lords gazed back impassively, circling him with blades raised. Mazdek staggered forward. A tomb blade sunk into his thigh, shearing straight through his gore-encrusted plate, but he barely felt the blow. Still, choking with laughter, he hurled himself at his foe, striking the sword-bearing wight in the chest and wrapping his arms around the dead thing in a crushing embrace. They fell together, toppling down a mountain of corpses and shattered bone. The Deathbringer felt the chill of the grave seeping through his flesh as the White Lord stabbed again and again, turning his chest to bloody ruin. His axe tumbled from his hands. The combatants landed hard. Mazdek looked down to see a sword impaled through his chest to the hilt. His foe opened its mouth and let out a rattling hiss. With the last of his strength, Mazdek made his final offering, growling as he tugged the tomb blade free from his flesh and thrust it into the undead tyrant's glowing eye socket. Finally, the corpse lights dimmed. The thing shuddered and was still. The Deathbringer felt bony hands clawing into his back, reaching up to dig into his eyes and throat. The skeletal tide rose up to swallow him. They tore at his flesh, peeling it from his body like the skin of a fruit. He was still laughing as his throat was opened, blood bubbling down his chest. The last of the undead kings approached through the clawing tide, his great black axe held aloft. Madzek favored the creature with a final gore-splattered smile. "Mighty Khorne," he rasped, "witness my—" The axe came down and bit into the Deathbringer's neck. Upon his great brass throne, the blood god Khorne saw his faithful bring strife and slaughter to the sterile lands of the dead, and his roar was one of triumph and of hatred both. He raised his dread blade high, the ender of worlds, all slaughter. With a bellow he brought it down and smote reality itself asunder. A deafening thunder rolled across the sterile valleys of the harrowed spine, the thunderous eruption of 1,000 volcanic ranges at once. Mountains crumbled and fell, crushing legions of fleshless warriors to dust. From beneath the catacombs of Coldspite came a rushing roar. A torrent of blood erupted into the grand hall, sending fountains of scalding gore rippling through the ancient fortress. Undead chattel would dissolve to nothing in an instant as the bubbling liquid splattered across them. As a surge became a flood, pouring in from rampants and high arched windows, becoming a waterfall as it tumbled away into the valley below. The last White King of the mountain stood imperiously before the flood, staring in silent defiance as the tide of gore crashed down upon him. Amidst the gushing blood fountain, shapes began to emerge, rangy, muscled killers with eyes like smouldering coals, bat-winged horror as huge as castle towers, roaring in exultation at the slaughter that awaited them. Howling in praise to their master, they crashed into the army of the dead, and the carnage began anew. The blood god knew a brief moment of satisfaction, but it was swiftly replaced by familiar, burning rage. The blood flowed, but not in quantities great enough, not nearly enough. With a bellow, he ordered more of his legions forward. This sterile land would burn in the fires of his rage, and its pretender tyrant would burn along with it.